Hey, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am Xavier Smith, and today I'm going to talk about the structure of the nervous system. So let's get started. Neurons are specialized nerve cells that help you gather information about your environment, then interpret this information, and then you react to it. So you touch a hot stove, the nerves will gather that information, then they're going to interpret, wow, that's hot. I should not be touching that. And your reaction is going to be a quick muscle contraction and you're going to fling your arm back. So the neuron consists of three main regions. The dendrites, which are right here at the end, they receive the information from other neurons and then sends it to the cell body, which the cell body is just right off the dendrites and it contains the nucleus. So the cell body contains the nucleus and other organelles. So it's just like a little cell in there. It's the main parts of the cell. And then there's the axon, which is this big long tail that has like myelin sheaths on it. Some neurons don't have myelin sheaths, but that just means the impulse traveling down it is slower. We'll talk about that later. And that axon passes the impulses in other neurons onto other neurons or muscles. So the dendrite receives the information from another neuron, then the cell body gets it, like interprets it, and sends it down the axon. Then the axon, right here at the axon endings, it will send off the impulse through neurotransmitters to the dendrite of another neuron, and it just keeps going until it gets to the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. That is another thing to talk about, the brain and the spinal cord. A lot of these things you're going to be feeling, like your fingers, the nerves in your fingers are part of the peripheral nervous system, which means it's like to the side of your central nervous system. It really just feels things and then sends that information to the central nervous system. Central nervous system interprets that and sends it back out for a reaction. Central nervous system is your spinal cord and your head. So like everything in your head, your brain. Okay, good to get that done with. Three types of neurons. There are sensory neurons, which just send impulses from receptors in the skin and organs to the brain and the spinal cord. So you feel something and you're like, oh, wow. So these nerves in my fingers, these neurons, are feeling and they're just sending impulses to my central nervous system, my spinal cord, and my brain. Interneurons just carry impulses to motor organs. So the central nervous system may say, okay, well, I want one of these organs, which could be like, it's just an organ that causes things to move, like controls movement. So it could be the interneuron could be sent and then for a reaction of like me pulling my hand away if it's not good, if it's too hot or something. Then there's motor neurons, which carry impulses away from the brain and spinal cord and towards a gland or muscle. So that could also be like a contraction. And then there's nerve impulse. The nerve impulse completes a reflex arc, which is a nerve pathway that consists of a sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron. So if you touch a hot stove, the sensory neurons are going to be like in your fingers. You're going to touch that. You're going to be like, oh, that's hot. Might not even get to the central nervous system. It might just go to like a motor neuron. And that thing says, okay, get that off, and whoosh, muscle contraction real quick. Right? So it completes your reflex arc where it could go to an interneuron and it's carrying your impulses to your motor organs. So it's causing you to move. And then your motor neurons are actually contracting that muscle to bring your hand away. Now let's talk about a nerve impulse as well. We're just going to keep going on about nerve impulses. So a neuron at rest, to start, there are sodium ions, which are Na+, collects on the outside of a cell membrane, and potassium ions, K+, collect on the inside of a cell membrane. So the cell is taking in potassium potassium ions and excreting and like expelling sodium ions. So there's a higher concentration of potassium on the inside of the cell and a higher concentration of sodium outside the cell. So there's a charge difference. Then a nerve impulse is also called an action potential, so I may use that word as well. The minimum stimulus needed to cause an action potential is called a threshold. So when the stimulus reaches that threshold, has enough like energy, then channels in the plasma membrane open, and we're going to talk about sodium comes into the cell, potassium goes out of the cell, and that causes a charge indifference. So we have a bunch of sodium on the outside of the cell, bunch of potassium inside the cell. So we have these little like membrane passageways that open. So sodium starts coming into the cell because it's just diffusing into the cell, doesn't cause energy, doesn't take energy. And then some of the potassium is going to go out of the cell. So the cell membrane has more positive charge and more channels open up and potassium leaves the cell. So as sodium comes in, the charge of the cell, like inner cell membrane, goes up. It gets more positive. And while it gets positive, then other cell membrane channels will open up as well and allows more sodium to come in and more potassium to leave. So the potassium will restore the positive charge outside the cell, but the charges go from positive, negative to positive. And this charge then moves along the axon, like that tail, like a wave. And that plays an important part in our next whiteboard and our last whiteboard. So we have our axon, correct? And we have these myelin sheaths, which are just those big blobs. Then we have the charges that move down our axon, and these little areas between myelin sheaths are called nodes. So nodes along the axon allow ions to pass through this myelin layer and to the cell membrane, basically meaning that the charge is like at the top. It's accessible. Then the action potential can jump from node to node. So the action potential just skips over this whole myelin sheath, and the ions are like charged in between the myelin sheaths and on the nodes, and it just allows the action potential to jump from node to node, and this increases the speed that the action potential can move, and then it just gets sent off to the next neuron. Now we're going to talk how it gets to the next neuron. So there is our neuron and then two other neurons. The gap between this axon here in our first neuron and the axon endings and between the next dendrites of the other neurons is called a synapse. Now, to get over that gap, we use something called neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitters are just chemicals. They are released by the axon endings of one neuron, and then the dendrites of the other neurons have receptors, and they pick up those neurotransmitters. Then again, they send them to their cell body. Cell body sends them to their axons. Then those get sent out with neurotransmitters to more neurons. So I hope this video on the structure of the nervous system was helpful, and please comment if you have any questions.